This raises larger questions. If I'm going to use a postmodern concept to understand Austrian economics, then we need to know how else they may or may not relate. In 1979, philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard defined postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives. While it is true that Austrian economics is as much a product of the modern era as is neoclassical economics, many of the core principles of Austrian thought seem to better mesh with such postmodern understandings of reality. As neoclassical economists strive to define all of life according to mathematical constructs, Austrian economists stand in challenge, pointing out that the neoclassical and Keynesian economists are missing a great deal of the details that comprise life. The world is not a machine, Austrians argue, with humanity as mere cogs, subject to manipulation. Philosophers have largely rejected the idea that there is some overarching meta-narrative, some vast story of what is going on in Western history, notes theologian and philosopher John Caputo. They denounce such stories as totalizing, and they are more inclined to see history in terms of innumerable little narratives, competing stories that throw the big picture into question. Much of this incredulity arises out of a sense of our contingency, our limited knowledge, and how this impacts our understanding of the world around us. The postmodern emphasis on situatedness is consistent with the Austrian principle of subjectivism. The language of modern economics, due to the demands for determinacy, states Bethke, crowds out questions of subjective assessment, institutional context, social embeddedness, knowledge as opposed to information, judgment, entrepreneurship, creativity, process, and history. In contrast, Alan Oakley states that in the eyes of Austrians, agents must deliberate and make choices on the basis of their own individual interpretations and understandings of the problems and environments that they confront. Whatever may be the limitations of this understanding that come from lack of information and or shortcomings of the agent's cognitive capacities, their actions as individuals are to be understood as the result of the meaning they attribute to the environment and to the telos of the pursuit of their objectives. Oakley's comments point to another congruence between the Austrian approach and postmodernity, an acknowledgement of error, ignorance, and uncertainty. The world, says John Caputo, is a lot more complicated than the moderns think, a lot messier, less well-programmed, less rule-governed, more open-ended, and more textured. Mises would have concurred, for he held that man is certainly not a perfect being. His human weakness taints all human institutions, and thus also the market economy. And yet, as mentioned above, open-endedness is not paralyzing. Humans act despite limited knowledge and in the face of an uncertain future. We must recognize, according to Kirzner, the extent to which both individual action and social coordination through the market can occur significantly despite the uncertainty of the future. In the words of Caputo, we're required to act, but our decisions are covered by a thin film, a quiet and uneasy sense of unknowing. Further, Austrians share with postmodernity an appreciation of the value, even necessity, of imagination and creativity to human functioning. Where neoclassical determinism would seem to focus on what philosopher Richard Kearney calls the suspect role of imagining within the pre-given order of society, Austrians see any order that arises as a product of human creativity and even ignorance. As Ebeling notes, many of the most basic institutions of the society, the Austrians have argued, are the unintended outcomes of individual action. Language and law, social customs and etiquette, cultural rules of context and manners all represent such instances. Now, I will acknowledge it's anachronistic to say that Menger and Mises and Hayek were postmodern thinkers, it does seem to be the case that a confluence of ideas may be evident. And if we acknowledge that both postmodernism and Austrian economics bear the marks of modern sensibilities out of which they arose, then it becomes easier to see how they may work together towards something that points beyond those origins. To say that Austrian economics deserves an ongoing place at the table in discussions of defining what economic thought is and can do is not to deny neoclassical economics' value or significance. It's rather, as Caputo suggests, to keep an eye out for the little ones, the voices and languages and peoples of the past that were ground up in the big story that history tells, which tends to be the story told by the winners. Austrian economics has important messages to be voiced within the dominant narrative. If we fail to acknowledge our humanity within disciplines such as this, we risk losing it elsewhere in the future. Economics as a discipline became scientific over the last quarter century, but I put the word in quotation marks, and I deliberately use it pejoratively here, laments James Buchanan. Our graduate schools are producing highly trained, highly intellectual technicians who are blissfully ignorant of the whole purpose of their alleged discipline. The Austrians caution against such scientism and seek to remind us of our limitations and our contingency. Hayek provided a similar view in his 1974 Nobel lecture when he said the recognition of the insuperable limits to his knowledge ought to teach the student of society a lesson in humility, which should guard him against becoming an accomplice to man's fatal striving to control society. Of course, for those of the Austrian school to expect to be treated with respect in economic dialogue, they must be willing to engage in dialogue themselves. While they need not yield their core principles, perhaps it is time to sacrifice what some have called their dubious reputation for being a particularly quarrelsome lot. Warren J. Samuels gets to this concept when he states that it's not possible to rely on reality or the facts to settle the issues which emerge in these interschool conflicts. It's the definition of reality itself that's at issue. It's also possible, indeed quite likely, that the object of study, the economy, is multifaceted so that more than one theory or paradigm can apply to it. Most likely, no one universal absolute theory can exhaustively describe and or explain the economy. There's certainly a risk in accepting such a position for a school that perhaps owes its very survival thus far to its pugnacious attitude. But if they wish to call into question the universal claims of neoclassical economics, they must be willing to apply the critique of universal claims to themselves as well. If Austrians truly desire to be effective in a postmodern context, it's time for them to, as Sally McFaig says, say something small with conviction and listen to others. Thank you.